Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Shevuot. We are up to Perek Daled, Mishnah Gimel. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'elui Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Ranbai, Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Chana bad Miriam, Sason ben Ryan, Yoshua ben Shifra, Menuchatam began Eden, Amen. Elhavdil ben Chaim lechaim v'derefua shelemav, Daniel Shalom ben Rosa, Betor Shah Cholei Yisrael, and Dachlama Merav, Benjamin Od Zion Chai ben Dvorah. The Mishnah illustrates the basic case of the oath of testimony. Shevuot ha'edut ketzad. What is a case of an oath of testimony? Amar lishnayim bo v'ha'iduni. If someone said to two people who know testimony that can benefit him in a case involving money, come and testify for me. Shevuah shenanu yodin lecha edut, and they answered, we swear that we do not know any testimony for you. O shamrulo en anu yodin lecha edut, or they said to him without swearing, we do not know any testimony for you. Mashbiya ani alechem, and he then said to them, I impose an oath upon you. V'amru amen, and they answered amen. When someone answers amen to an oath that is imposed upon him, it is as if he said, I swear. The Mishnah could also have said that they become obligated for a false oath, not by answering amen, but simply by repeating their denial after the oath was imposed, as we learned in Mishnah 1. The Mishnah gives the example of witnesses who answered amen because it is the shorter of the two responses, but in any event, the Mishnah says, in either of these cases, if they later admit that they lied and swore falsely, they are obligated to bring an offering for making a false oath of testimony. The Mishnah discusses how many offerings witnesses are obligated to bring when the oath is imposed on them several times, and they deny knowing testimony. The law for this depends on the circumstances. The Mishnah discusses three cases. The first case, Hishbiya le'en chamisha pamim chutz bedin. If he imposed the oath on the witnesses 5 times outside of court, and they denied knowing testimony each time, ubao lebedin v'hodu, and then they came to court and admitted that they lied, Peturim, they are not obligated to bring an offering. This is because the law of the oath of testimony applies only to witnesses who deny knowing testimony in court, as the sages stated in the previous Mishnah. This is learned from the verse in Vaikra chapter 5 verse 1 that says, Im lo yagid v'nasa vono, if he will not tell the testimony, he shall bear a sin. This implies that the verse is speaking of a place where if he would tell, his testimony would be effective, meaning in court. The second case, kafru, however, if they came to court and denied knowing the testimony in court, chayvim al kol achat ve'echad, they are obligated to bring a separate offering for each and every one of the 5 oaths imposed on them outside of court. When the witnesses deny knowing testimony in court, their denial is understood to refer back to all the oaths that were imposed on them previously. And the Gemara on page 32a learns from a verse that a person can be obligated to bring a number of offerings for one denial. This cannot refer to a case where the witnesses denied knowing testimony outside of court, because the law of the oath of testimony does not apply to testimony denied outside of court, as we learned earlier. Therefore, it must refer to testimony that was denied in court. And the Mishnah teaches that the key factor is not where the oaths were imposed, but where the testimony was denied. As long as the testimony was denied in court, the witnesses must bring separate offerings for all the oaths imposed on them out of court. The third case, Hishbiya le'en chamisha pamim bifnei bedin v'chafru, if he imposed the oath upon them 5 times in court and they denied knowing testimony, and an chayvin ele'echad, they are obligated to bring only one offering. Amar Rabbi Shimon matam, Rabbi Shimon said, what is the reason for this? Why is this case different from the preceding one, in which the witnesses were obligated to bring one offering for each oath imposed on them, upon them outside of court? Because once these witnesses deny knowing testimony in court, they cannot return and admit that they do know testimony, since the court does not accept the change of testimony by witnesses. Denying testimony in court is considered a testimony that the person does not know anything. Therefore, if the witnesses later change their minds and say that they do know testimony, the court will not accept it from them because of the rule that once a witness has testified, he cannot return and testify about the same matter. What the Gemara in Ketubot page 18b says, Kivan shegid shuvin chozer magid. Therefore, once they denied the first oath in court, the second oath was meaningless because it was imposed on someone who was no longer eligible to testify. The law of the oath of testimony does not apply to those who are not eligible to testify, as we learned in Mishnah 1. Even if they were silent until after all 5 oaths were imposed upon them in court, and they then denied knowing testimony, they are still obligated to bring only one offering. The verse that teaches that witnesses can become obligated in several offerings with one denial is not referring to this case, but only to the case of oaths imposed outside of court, with the testimony later being denied in court. The reason for this is that if all the oaths were imposed in court with a single denial at the end, it's not logical for them to have to bring separate offerings for each. If we treat their silence to the first oath as a denial, then all the oaths that followed were meaningless, since they could no longer have changed their testimony like we explained. And if we do not treat their silence as a denial, then they were still bound by the first oath to testify. The second oath added nothing, and it is simply an oath on an oath, which does not take effect. Therefore, the verse cannot be referring to the case where the oaths were imposed in court. The verse can only be referring to the case where the oaths were imposed outside of court, where the witnesses could still have changed their minds and testified, and then later denied in court. And that is then of Mishnah Gimel. Since two witnesses are generally needed in money matters in order to force a person to pay, as it speaks about in Dvarim, chapter 19, verse 15, the law of the oath of testimony applies only in a case where there were at least two witnesses who could testify for the claimant. Witnesses who deny knowing testimony do not bring an offering for swearing falsely about this, unless their testimony would have helped the person asking for it to collect money. Mishnah 4, Mishnah Dalet teaches the circumstances in which two or more witnesses who deny testimony become obligated to bring an offering. Kafru shnein ka'achat. If the two witnesses denied knowing testimony at the same time, now it is impossible for two people to say something at exactly the same time. However, if one statement is made and then another is made immediately afterward, within the amount of time it takes to say the words, Shalom Alecha Rabbi, peace upon you, my teacher, the two statements are legally considered to have been made at the same time, what we call toch kidei dibur, kedibur dami. Shneim chayvin, so in that case, they are both obligated to bring offerings, bazeh achar zeh, but if they made their denials one after the other, meaning if the time that passed from the end of the first denial until the beginning of the second denial was longer than the time it takes to say Shalom Alecha Rabbi, harishon chayav v'sheni patur, the first witness is obligated to bring an offering, but the second one is not obligated. The first witness is obligated because at the time he denied knowing testimony, it was still possible for both witnesses to testify and force the defendant to pay. His denial therefore caused the claimant to lose money, since it prevented him from collecting. However, when the second witness denied knowing testimony, this was no longer possible, since the first witness was not eligible anymore to testify about this case. Once a person has denied knowing testimony in court, he is no longer eligible to testify about that matter, as we learned in the previous Mishnah. Therefore, the second witness did not cause any loss by his denial to the person asking for his testimony. He therefore does not bring an offering. Although a single witness cannot obligate someone to pay, he can obligate him to make an oath that the money is his. Even though most people would rather pay than swear falsely, since his testimony cannot by itself force a defendant to pay, his denial was not a direct cause of a loss. An offering is therefore not required for it. Kafar echad ve'oda echad. If one of the witnesses denied knowing testimony and the other one admitted that he knew testimony, hakofer chayav, the one who denied knowing testimony is obligated to bring an offering, regardless of which witness spoke first. Since the other witness was willing to testify, the one who denied knowing testimony caused the loss of the person who asked for his testimony. The Mishnah contrasts the rules we just learned about a single set of witnesses with those that apply to two sets of witnesses. If there were two sets of witnesses who were asked by someone to testify on his behalf, and the first set denied knowing testimony, and afterward the second set denied knowing testimony, both sets are obligated to bring offerings, because the testimony could have been established to either set of witnesses. In this case, even after the first set denied knowing any testimony, the person asking for testimony could have collected by having the second set testify for him. Therefore, when the second set denied knowing testimony, they also caused him to lose money. And the Gemara on page 33a asks that for this very reason, the first set should not be obligated to bring an offering, since they did not cause any loss to the person asking them to testify. He could still have collected by having the second set come and testify for him. And the Gemara answers that the Mishnah is discussing a case where the second set could not have testified at the time the first set was asked to do so, because the witnesses of the second set were related to each other through marriage. For example, they were brother-in-laws. People who are related to each other we know cannot testify together. Since only the first set could have testified at the time they were asked, Their denial caused the person asking them to lose money. However, after the first set denied knowing testimony, the second set became unrelated. The wife to whom they were related died, and then they were asked to testify. Since they are now eligible to testify together, their denial again causes a loss. And that is the Nabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.